Our next speaker, our first post-lunch, sorry, I don't know what's up with that. First post-lunch non-lightning talk speaker is Greg Koberger. His talk is going to be a developer's approach to documentation from passive to dynamic.
Thank you. Okay, so all of you spent the money and time to come to Portland to attend a conference called Write the Docs. Whether it's your job or maybe your hobby, I think it's safe to assume that most people here really like writing documentation. I have a confession though. My name is Gregory Koberger, and I hate writing documentation. So, when a normal person has a problem, they find a solution. When a developer has a problem though, they found a company. So a few years ago, I got fed up with documentation, partially writing it, but also consuming crappy documentation. There's so much bad documentation out there, and as a developer, I spent most of my life just reading bad documentation and hating it. So, about 3 or 4 years ago, I applied to Combinator in San Francisco, which is for those of you who don't know, it's a startup accelerator. So you apply, it's a 3-month program, and they kind of help your company go from wherever you were when you started to being bigger, have more money, whatever it happens to be. So I had no product, I had nothing at the time. All I knew was that I didn't like documentation. So I applied with, a landing page that said, writing good documentation is hard, but it doesn't have to be, really. And that was like the entire product I had. I had no product, definitely no users, definitely no revenue at all. But surprisingly, we got an interview. So I went down to Mountain View in California, and for those of you who don't know, the way it works is that they invite about 10% of the applicants down to do interviews, 10-minute interviews. And then after those 10-minute interviews, they invite a fraction. So they invite about 50 people, or 50 companies to 100 companies to come join and do the 3-month program. So we got the interview. It was a 10-minute interview, and they just pepper you with questions, and it's the quickest 10 minutes of your life. So I walk into the room, and there's a few YC partners, and they say, okay, what do you do? So we give them the basic elevator pitch, the whole, writing good documentation is hard, but it doesn't have to be, really. And we kind of go into a little bit of what it is, and they stop us and say, okay, so you guys write documentation for people. I said, oh, no, I don't do that. What I do is, we're trying to build tools to make writing documentation easier for people to document their own APIs or code libraries or whatever else. We're a tools company, we don't write documentation. So they said, okay. So they started asking more questions about, our market size and the TAM and a bunch of other businessy things that I don't know, or didn't know at the time. And finally they're like, okay, let's see the product. So you remember before I said I didn't have a product, but what I did have was 2 days before I had gone through and I had kind of cobbled together a MVP that, as long as I was controlling the mouse, I could kind of navigate through it and it would look like a real site, but as soon as the wrong button was clicked, the entire thing would come crashing down. It was a bit like a Hollywood set where it looked beautiful from exactly where you were, but if you looked at it from a different angle, it was very obvious it was all held together with duct tape and completely fake. So that actually went pretty well. The demo went pretty well. They started to kind of understand it and all that. I'm like, oh, this is going really well. This is exciting. So we get a knock on the door, and it's the person saying 10 minutes is up. So that was the end of the interview. I'm like, well, that was really quick. It felt like 10 seconds. So the partner who's been talking to us kind of sits back, starts digesting everything we had talked about, because it's a very rapid fire. So he's thinking about it. And he looks up at me, and he sums the entire thing up, and he goes to me, so, you just really like writing documentation, huh? I'm like, no. So that's when I knew I did not get into YC at that point. And that was my fault because, I did a bad job of pitching it. So I kind of left, went back to my actual job. I was working at Mozilla at the time. And I couldn't shake the idea, though, that documentation was so important. As a developer, I may work with code libraries, I may work with APIs, but most of my life is spent looking at documentation and interacting with documentation. And documentation is just so vital. If an API falls in the forest, he's a stupid joke, and there's no documentation, does anyone hear it? It kind of falls apart at the end, but basically, without documentation, it doesn't matter how good what you've done is, no one can consume it. So, I'm almost done talking about my history. I just want to give you a little background of where I'm coming from. But we did end up applying again about 6 months ago to YC. We got in this time. The company is README. Same basic concept, that documentation is vitally important. However, there's hopefully a slightly better way to go about it. And our general mission is to reduce the learning curve of getting started with an API or code library down to 0. So, I said I don't like writing documentation, and that is kind of true, but I still respect it and see how important it is. I like when other people write good documentation. So here's some reasons why I dislike writing documentation. First is that's a lot of work. And I'm not even talking that the API or code library is hard to document. I'm saying to get to the point where you can write the first line of documentation is a lot of work. As in, if you're at a big company, maybe you already have some sort of system. But if you're at a startup or you just have like a little side project or something, your options are, you either use GitHub and just kind of post it on there, or you have to spend time to build your own site. Stripe quality documentation, or Twilio quality documentation, or Django quality documentation, it doesn't happen overnight. The site takes years and years of work to get to where it is, before even a line or a paragraph of text is written. So it's actually really hard, because I would always, when I was working at a company and they're like, okay, now document it, I would spend the first week building out a website that looked like the brand and was easy to navigate and stuff like that. And then I would have like 2 days at the end of the week to actually write or 2 hours to write the actual documentation. Second is that it's really easy to forget things. So this is a quote that I really like, or a tweet. It's, shipping an API is hard. Shipping an API, which can be consumed with fewer engineers than it took to implement, is really, really hard. I don't know how many of you are developers, but writing a basic API is really, really simple. It's the most basic. There's no HTML, there's no JavaScript. You just get parameters and you return JSON or whatever, or XML or whatever you happen to be doing. The problem is everything's obvious to you. It's not obvious to the person consuming it. So if I made the world's most simple API, I might think, it's obvious. Of course you pass in the API token on each call, or of course you have to do this or do this. And as you all know, it's not that easy. And third, this is my biggest gripe with a lot of times when I see documentation, is that English is very ambiguous. Don't get me wrong, I love English. I like it so much I chose to give this talk in English. But it's not the best way to kind of write documentation. So if you look on the left, it doesn't matter, you can't see the code. It's a little blurry, but basically I have kind of like two snippets of code. The left side is the code that was actually written to build the API. It's written in a precise language that is very structured properly. It's so logical and unambiguous that a computer can read through it and understand exactly what's going on. Every single error, every single nuance, every single edge case has been specifically kind of laid out and written out very logically in a way that computers and humans can understand. Then on the right side, we have the same exact thing. The person consuming the code library or the API is also using a very precise, structured language. It's a language, whatever language it is, it's so precise that a random semicolon isn't just a grammatical mistake, it actually brings the whole thing crumbling down. Yet, for some reason, we often try to transfer knowledge between the left and the right using English. A language that's so ambiguous that buffalo, 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 buffalo is totally valid. That's obviously, a hypothetical example, the buffalo stuff, but English, we try to kind of like write away the ambiguity by just writing more and more paragraphs, talking about edge cases and things like that. When, for me, if it's open source, lots of times, and this is not the right way to do it, lots of times it's easier just to go and look at the code and see exactly what's happening. So at this point, you probably all think you know where this talk's going. You're probably thinking that I'm about to say, I know the future, and it is, we are going to generate documentation. You guys are all going to be out of a job. There's going to be, we're just going to have a computer generate all the documentation. That's actually worse, though. There's nothing worse than going to an API and having, all they have is just generated documentation. Some developer someplace ran a script, and all it did was just generate some static HTML files, and they forgot about it. That's bad for two things. One, as you all know, it's really bad because it's like handing someone a dictionary and saying learn English. Reference guides are really good if you already kind of know what you're doing and you just need to look something up, much like a dictionary if you don't know a word. But it's absolutely horrendous to try to learn how to use an API just from looking at the definitions. And two, it's really bad because these developers think they have documentation. Stripe did an amazing job. Stripe, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stripe's docs, but it's done an amazing job in like the developer community of kind of showing how important documentation is. But a lot of people think just because the documentation looks like Stripe's, it's a 3-column layout, there's like the black side with some code in it, there's some text, and there's like, they think that's good documentation. And that's so not true. And the biggest problem with this generated code stuff is that people will generate it, think it looks like stripes, and not realize that just because it looks like it doesn't mean it's as good as it. So I'm definitely not advocating just generating code, or generating documentation. What we need is kind of a happy medium. Oh, sorry, that's really hard to see. Back in the 60s, IBM ran this ad campaign called it was called the Paperwork Explosion. It was, for some reason, made by the Jim Henson Company back when they were doing commercials. And in it, they talk about something called, what they call the IBM Pollyanna Principle. And what that is that machines should do the work because that's what they're good at. People should think because that's what they're good at. If you've heard, you may not have heard, you probably have not seen this commercial, but there's been a bunch of songs that sample it, these exact quotes and stuff. Oftentimes it's kind of dire and it's talking about how machines are going to replace us and stuff. But it's called the Pollyanna Principle because the point is that they're trying to free up, they have a good outlook on the future. They were talking about printers, that's not really relevant, but it is a good way to kind of look at how I think of documentation. So quick aside, back in the 1990s, eBay was just starting up, or I'm sorry, PayPal was just starting up, but PayPal was not the only payment processor out there. There was dozens of them. But they had a huge problem, and that problem was that the Russian mob was using these payment processors to either defraud people, or defraud the company, or just launder money. So fraud was a huge problem back then. It still is, but it was a huge problem back then. And companies who were doing payment processing fell into kind of two different categories, two different camps. The first camp was like, you know what? Technology's great, but we're going to use humans. And that was great, because humans are actually very good at sorting through all the information, figuring out, okay, this guy is buying something from the US, but he's shipping it to a US address, but he's very clearly from wherever else. So we can kind of get a vibe pretty easily whether or not something is, something off is about it. That worked out really great, and it stopped fraud, but the problem with that was that it was very slow. No one wanted to wait 2 weeks in order to get back their, have their payments cleared. The other camp went all in on, technology. They're like, you know what? We're going to have, the most brilliant systems. And it turns out technology, it's fast, but it's not as good as humans. It's actually kind of doing the curating and figuring things out. So the way that PayPal won was they kind of combined the two. They had the computers do all the tedious work, and they had the computers figure out and surface the important information, and they had the humans come and do the actual, the hard work, the stuff that computers will never actually be able to do. That's kind of a contrived example, but it's also a very good way to kind of think of how we can use computers and humans to work together. It's not a this or that. So many of you have probably read an article by a guy named Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who was one of the Django founders. He might be here, I have no clue. But for me, it was the kind of turning point from, this is back when I was just a developer a few years ago, and I just thought documentation was documentation. I knew that some documentation was good and some was bad, but I didn't really understand why. So I read this article, and he splits into 3 different sections of documentation, talks about why each is important, and why you can't launch an API or code library without all 3. And for me, it was very obvious once I read it, but it was kind of that turning point where I was like, oh, it takes a lot of thought to build good documentation. So you guys probably don't know these, but I'll just run through them quickly just so we're on the same page. But the first thing he talks about is reference guides. Those are kind of the low-level, deep dive, dictionary-esque, here's the parameters, here's what's required, here's what's returned, things like that. There's examples or tutorials, which kind of, the goal is to walk you through a specific actionable use case. And in theory, by the end of it, you have something working or whatever. And there's topical guides. Topical guides are the higher level, why you want to use it. There's a little bit of marketing information thrown in there. But the point of the topical guides is basically to get people to understand and buy into the mindset. That's kind of the why, whereas the examples are the how. The examples might give you a superficial understanding. Sometimes that's bad because you want people to know more. Sometimes that's good because sometimes people just don't care enough about your API. They just want to use it and move on. So he talks about these 3 things. One thing that he didn't talk about that I think is equally important, if not more, is a 4th, which is support. Support is incredibly important. When I started learning PHP a bunch of years ago, that was my first language, I spent a lot of time in the support section. partially because I was just learning and I needed to kind of learn, but mainly because PHP is insanely inconsistent. Some functions will use camel case, some will use underscores, they have no like naming conventions, they have nothing. Like you literally have to either have the world's greatest memory or you spend all your time on the docs looking stuff up, like which parameter comes first. But what PHP did was they had comments, and the comments were like 8 times as long as the actual documentation, if not more. But it was great because you could just Control F and find whatever you needed. And that's, I've always kind of found that the best online documentation has a huge component of support. So now that we're kind of on the same page as far as like how I split up different types of documentation, here's kind of how my mental model of the division of labor. So, computers are really good at generating this reference docs. We shouldn't stop there, but we can't deny that they're actually very good at keeping things up to date. It's so easy and so common for a developer to add a parameter or change something and forget to update the docs. So all of a sudden, you're trying to pass in a parameter, but it turns out it's been changed or whatnot. So it's really great to kind of let computers, and there's so many tools that do this already. You guys know all of them. For like APIs, there's Swagger, and there's a few others. For like code, every language has 4 or 5 different ways to generate documentation and display it. So that's great. Now examples is where it starts to get a little interesting. Examples, we can't just have a computer generate examples. If we wrote a script, no matter how good it was, a computer doesn't understand that, for example, Stripe's API, that things like making a charge is way more important to people than update your mother's maiden name or something. That's the kind of thing where computers are bad at. What computers are good at, though, is let's say we wanted to show 15 examples for an API, and we want to show it in 5 different languages. We want to show it in like curl example, a Python example, a Rails example, 2 more. That's 75 examples that a human being has to keep up to date, and that's insane. So we kind of need a happy medium there. That's where humans start coming in. We can let computers start generating example code, things like that, keeping up to date with the reference guides because we have all this metadata. However, we need a human to curate and realize what's important. And on top of that, we really need humans to kind of add context. A snippet of code is great for copying and pasting, but without context, it's just a random snippet of code. Oops. No, I went too far. So humans are really great at building guides, obviously, as well. We can't have computers generate these topical guides, and that's why computers will never replace humans, because we really, really, really need these guides done. But the last part that works on docs is the community. And I think that's something that we're starting to see more and more, is the community involvement. On README for the topical guides, we realize that so often developers will be trying to figure something out, they'll run into an issue, and they'll spend like 45 minutes trying to figure out what was wrong. Maybe the docs are wrong, maybe they just misunderstood the docs. For whatever reason, they get stuck. They spend 20 minutes, an hour, 2 days, whatever it is, and they figure it out. But what happens is if they don't update the docs, or they don't tell someone, the next person to come to the docs is going to have the same problem. And we end up repeating this process of dozens of people going out into the world and trying to figure out what's wrong. So having the community be able to do things like, they can't write the docs. You can't give them a blank page and be like, document our code for us. But what you can do is you can really help crowdsource a lot of the unique uses for your API, or the weird edge cases, or even typos. And last is support. We talked about support a bit already, but I really like this concept of support because documentation, a few people have talked earlier, and a few people later on today and tomorrow are going to talk about how documentation should be a story. It should be structured well. I mean, most of you probably spend all of your time thinking about how to structure it, what should go where, how to transition between different docs. Support can kind of be the Wild West because there's so many different use cases for APIs and ways to use your API that there is no possible way that you could build a cohesive story around writing documentation. So you kind of just need a bucket that you can kind of like hide and only have it surfaceable by people who are either browsing or Googling, of just kind of let anyone ask weird questions or ask whatever they want. One of the worst things for me is when someone emails us or README is like, hey, can we disable the support form? Because we want people to like email us directly. I'm like, that's horrible, because like for every one person that asks a question on Stack Overflow or wherever else, there's thousands of people that read that question and then read the answer and saves them hours or minutes of time. So that's the basic way that I look at kind of splitting up the 3 or 4 different types of documentation into generated, humans, and community. So one big problem that we have with documentation is what I'm calling the O'Reillyification of documentation. So I brought some O'Reilly books with me. Actually, so I write JavaScript a lot. I love this. This is JavaScript, the Definitive Guide. This gigantic, gigantic book. And this one's called JavaScript, the Good Parts. So it says a lot about JavaScript. I love JavaScript, but you know, it's very telling. So O'Reilly books are really well written. Like, you can get it, you can open it up, and it's thorough. It goes through everything about JavaScript. They usually have a little bit of personality in them. Like, I grew up on O'Reilly books. I love, and I'm using the word O'Reilly. Hopefully they're not a sponsor. But like, I mean about all kind of tech books. But the problem with that is that if you all ordered, you know, your JavaScript, the Definitive Guide, you would all get the same exact book. So, you know, maybe you're just learning how to program and you've never programmed before and you think JavaScript's a good way to get started. You know, maybe you are already a great C++ developer or something and you just want to transfer that knowledge to JavaScript. And maybe you already know JavaScript and you just want to have something on the side of the desk that you can look at. O'Reilly books, I made a joke about how big it is, but it has to be this big because it has to cover every single use case and every single skill level and all that. When we brought documentation online, we kind of just took it from analog to digital, and we didn't really rethink, like, wow, now we know everything about the user, we can start tailoring it to them. For example, here's a really simple use case, or a really simple example. If it's someone's first time on the docs, they probably want the onboarding flow. If it's their 50th time, maybe they want the reference docs or the error page. They probably don't want the onboarding flow. So we know these things about people, and we can start tailoring the documentation to that. So I'll go through this quickly, but the API ecosystem is basically static docs, dashboard, and API. If we start combining them, like I said, we know everything about the user, and we can start actually tailoring information to them. So at README, we have something called the MVC, minimum viable call. The point of the MVC is to do two things. One, it's to make sure that everything's set up properly. So it's a call that's so simple that it just makes sure that your API key is set up or your, the language is installed, whatever it happens to be. And two, it makes you do something very simple, something very basic. In this case, I use the Stripe example, but that's just charging a credit card 1 cent or something like that. And the best way to kind of get people new to your stuff is to get them using it and doing an actual action as quickly as humanly possible. So the goal is to try to get people to this MVC, the minimum viable call. Onboarding is a great way to do that. You can first learn about them. You figure out what language they're writing, you get their name, you get their email address, you just learn a little bit about them. Installation is where they install something on their computer or put the API key into their code or whatever that happens to mean. And then that's the MVC. You get to the MVC, which is basically the first call that gets them to do something. And it's so nice that if people can, they're not going to be able to use your product completely or whatever you're documenting within the first 2-3 minutes. But if they can make that call that quickly, it's very encouraging. Like, that kind of magical experience is why Twilio, like Kevin talked earlier about that, why Twilio is so big and why Stripe is so big, because they worried so much about getting to that MVC as quickly as possible. And then after that, you can just kind of give them actionable advice, or actionable things they can do, like make a charge, start a subscription. Rather than having people reverse engineer things like, post/charges, we can use English and say, make a charge and just make it copy and pastable. Okay, so we're going to finish this off with some things that don't seem like documentation, but actually are. So with README, a lot of people say, oh, you do documentation. And that's true. That's what our website says. But documentation, as you people all know, documentation is so much more than just paragraphs of text. Documentation, when done right, touches every single part of an API, a code library, whatever else. So first is interactive playgrounds. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then some sort of interactive playground where someone can click a button and get a response back is worth 1,000,000. Because no longer do you have to talk about all the error codes and edge cases and things like that. You can just kind of let them play around with it and tweak and see what happens. And that's not great for a deep knowledge of your product, but it's really great for someone who's kind of evaluating and trying it out and just testing things out. And we're also seeing a lot of people consuming software and APIs that are not CS majors. Before, you could kind of assume a basic level of competency in CS or whatever else, computer science. But now there's so many people who are technically literate enough that they just want to use Twilio to send a text message, or they want to use Stripe to charge for their new CD or something. And letting people actually play around with it and like get their hands dirty rather than having to read paragraphs of text is so incredibly valuable. Dashboards, we talked about already. It's insane that dashboards know everything about your user, yet they're usually siloed away from the documentation. They should be front and center. Error messages. So Angular, you can't really see it, it's really blurry, but Angular is just a regular JavaScript error. But Angular includes a URL. So you click that URL and it does something really cool. It takes you to the stack documentation about why the issue is happening or whatever, which is really great. But it also includes your stack trace. In the paragraphs, it actually like references the variable you're having a problem with or whatever else. They've kind of managed to blend, rather than like just showing you an error code and having you Google it and then having you find generic documentation, they've used a little bit of generic documentation, but also mixed in your own stuff. So it's very kind of like personalized to you. Next one is API SDKs. This is a big one that I think it's huge. They're very self-documenting. You really can't see the code, I'm sorry about that. But the top one's basically a curl like URL, which is how you would normally do an API call. And the bottom is an SDK. So the difference is authentication at the top one, you have to know that's passed in as the username and the password's blank and it has to be sent at every request and it has to have a trailing colon and like there's some weird stuff about it. Whereas if you use some sort of SDK, the SDK makes it really easy to kind of normalize these oddities. So, no longer do you have to like pass in the token as a user and like do something weird. You just say stripe.api key is equal to whatever and they normalize everything. Same with error codes, things like that. So a lot of a lot of like API purists don't like SDKs, but I think they're great for kind of self-documenting and helping people understand. And the last is support sections. As you all know, support is insanely big. When people ask like what our biggest competitor is, like I don't think like, other documentation services or whatever. I think that we're kind of all in together against something like Stack Overflow. And I love Stack Overflow so much. Like if I were a developer, when I am a developer and I Google an error code or something like that, if I have the option between a Stack Overflow page or the official documentation, 9 times out of 10, I end up on Stack Overflow. So I think the biggest threat to documentation is support. And rather than actually being against it, there's something really nice about embracing it and bringing it into your site and having that be the Wild West of your site that you can just throw content into and it doesn't have to be formatted, it doesn't have to be cohesive, it can just be a repository of whatever your customers ask or whatever you happen to think up and things like that. You don't have to fit it into the story that you're trying to tell in the documentation, it can just be like a repository for all this information. So that is basically it. The takeaway is basically that technology, as much as a lot of developers will try, will never, ever, 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 ever replace technical writers or human beings. They're so, so vital. But we can kind of meet halfway, and we can use technology to do what it's good at. We can have technology generate code in SDKs. We can use technology platforms to crowdsource help from our community. We can onboard new users and know about our users and learn about our users. I'm really hoping, I have gotten better on this whole liking documentation thing, and I'm really hoping that in 2, 3, 4 years, someone's up here and gives a talk and says, you know what, I used to hate it, but I love writing documentation now. Thank you.